Really good job.
Good afternoon. I'm Nancy, the chairwoman of the Baltimore County Planning Board, and welcome to the November 2nd, 2023 meeting. It is now called to order. I'll now start with a roll call to account for our members that are currently present. Mr. Array.
Here.
Ms. Brophy.
Here.
Ms. German.
Here.
Mr. Hafer. Mr. Heckman.
Here.
Mr. Heinel.
Here.
Mr. Hinton. I understand he'll be a few minutes late, but we're expecting him. Mr. Halipka.
Here.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. McGinnis.
Here.
Mr. Perlow. Ms. Panero. Mr. Warren.
Here.
Miss Wolfson.
Here.
Thank you all. Please join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Board members, as we always mention, when you're speaking, please make sure your mics are on, and when you're not, please make sure it's red. Please pay attention to your partner to make sure they're paying attention to the rules. Kathy, thank you for watching my back. Ms. Bensley, is there any changes to the tentative agenda as published?
No changes, Madam Chair.
Thank you. In the October 26, 2023 email, you received draft minutes from the October 19th meeting. Has everybody had an opportunity to look over the minutes? Is there any questions or comments? If none, can I entertain a motion to accept the minutes as they were circulated?
Motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. First on the agenda, we have a presentation by Ms. Jessie Bialik of the Department of Public Works and Transportation on the introduction of the bicycle pedestrian master plan. Ms. Bialik when she's finished her introduction, I will call for a motion to set a public hearing on the matter. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Bialik.
Hi, sorry, wow. I'm usually pretty loud without a microphone. Hi, Madam Chairwoman, members of the Planning Board. I'm Jessie Bialik. I am Baltimore County's bicycle and pedestrian planner. I recognize a few of your faces from my previous employment in the Department of Planning. So thank you for having me. We're very excited to announce our first countywide bicycle and pedestrian master plan. If you want to go ahead, Taylor. So just some background in case some folks don't know, the start of Baltimore County's planning of bike and ped infrastructure was first done in the Master Plan 2010, which has been a while. And what this plan does is it provides an update to both the Eastern Plan, which was done in 2006, and the Western Plans that was done in 2012. The new plan reflects changes in our development patterns and an increased enthusiasm around active transportation in the county. The big part of this plan that we're really excited about is the Eastern and Western plans only included the areas south of the Erdl. So what we did with this plan is also include the rural area as well. Go ahead. So what our plan is doing is it's going to be our guiding document to show the most impactful locations to implement future bike and pedestrian infrastructure in Baltimore County. It also identifies the policies and physical barriers we have to complete streets in the county, as well as active transportation, and delivers a prioritized bike and ped improvement project list for Baltimore County. This is the plan framework. It was broken up into sequential steps 1 through 4. The first was to establish our plan, vision, and goals. The second was to document our existing conditions. The third is to identify roles and responsibilities of key partners implementation. One of them, of course, being the state of Maryland, since most of our large roadways are owned and maintained by state, as well as to prioritize the bike and ped recommendations. So throughout the planning process, we collected input from community members and stakeholders around the county. We had 2 meetings with MDOT SHA to discuss the plan and see how we could better partner with them to get some of these projects implemented. We also did a vision statement, goals, and performance measures as well. So this is our vision statement and goals. Our goals are to increase safety, ensure equity, expand access and connectivity, enhance our public health, protect the environment, collaborate with partners, and create economic growth. And our vision statement is Baltimore County will consist of an active transportation network that is safe and accessible to improve the quality of life and health for our users of all ages, abilities, and demographics. This is a slide about some of the information we got from our public input meetings. So we held 7 pop-up events in each of our councilmanic districts. We also had 3 virtual meetings, as this was still mid coming out of COVID, so we didn't have any large public meetings for that. We had 60% of our survey respondents say they did not feel safe and were worried about getting hit by a bicycle as a large barrier to walking and biking, which I was not surprised to hear. And that their most desired improvements included sidewalks as well as shared use paths and trails. So our top themes from our public comment were increased safety, ensuring equity, providing access and connectivity, and promoting low stress facilities. So not just mainly on-road bikeways, but to be sure that we're doing shared use separated paths as well as multi-use trails. You can go ahead. Ooh, I think we skipped one. Go up one. There you go. Okay. This slide talks about the network approach that we used, which was to enhance all of our goals. So we took into account our existing conditions analysis as well as our public engagement efforts. And our draft network aims to recommend a connected, comprehensive, and low-stress facility for peoples of all ages and abilities. So what we used was our existing network, opportunities and constraints, demand analysis, equity analysis, safety analysis, bike share analysis, complete street inventory, plus our online survey, our interactive web map, our pop-up events, and our virtual public workshops. And we put all those together to come up with our network approach. This slide shows our implementation goals for the plan for each of our goals. We have annual goals. So for expanding access and connectivity, we hope to complete planning or design phase of at least one tier 1 project. So you'll see when I do a larger presentation that we have tiered our recommendations by most important down to, not most important, but most connected down to the least. So when we say tier 1, that's what I mean. Design and construct at least 6 miles of bikeways and or shared use paths from any of our priority tiers, as well as design and construct at least 2 miles of complete streets from any of our top priority tiers. For safety, it's to reduce bicycle and pedestrian crash rates by at least 3%. For enhancing public health, we want to provide new opportunities for active transportation and recreation from their prior year. For equity, we'd like 20% or more annual implementation funding in high equity need areas. To protect the environment, to decrease carbon dioxide emissions by at least 1% from the prior year. To create economic growth, we want to initiate at least one network improvement to increase access to commercial areas. And the last one is collaborating with partners, which is to evaluate stakeholder participation each year and identify further opportunities. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for having me.
Are there any questions?
Yes.
To what degree, if at all, were you coordinating with the city program? I'm assuming some of the bike lanes and things we want to flow into the city.
Right. So in the plan, we do show city connections. So we got all of their GIS data and saw how that we could further connect to the city, which is basically from on the west side is the Gwens Falls Trail is a big one. And then on the east side, we have Dundalk Avenue on that side as well. So yeah, we did try to look at all the connections to the surrounding counties as well as the city.
And I thought I saw some recent announcements that there's some public hearing I don't know the central part as well, but to connect, I guess, the NCS trail down to with what comes up from the city, is that part of the plan or is that something different?
Right. So as part of the plan, there's a recommendation to connect the NCR Trail at its current terminus at Ashland down to the Jones Falls Trail. So I had put in and received a Maryland Bikeways grant to do a feasibility study for that connection. And there is a public hearing or a public meeting on November 15th in the Cockeysville PAL Center to go over the feasibility study and potential alignments for that.
Ms. Brophy?
So I'm looking at the larger presentation. So it says there was like just under 1,300 online survey responses. When you say there was pop-up events in each council district, does that mean no notice was given out and they just popped up, or what do you mean by that?
Right, so we just showed, so as part of us and our consultant team, we just went to different locations. We did Towson University, UMBC, coffee shop up in Sparks, just to kind of grab people on the weekend or when we thought people might be biking and walking to just try to get some initial information out to them and to get some initial thoughts from them as well.
Do you have like the number of respondents you got from those pop-up events, or is that
So
included
in
that?
the appendix of that is all of that information.
Got it.
Yep, it's all there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have you created a map of the proposed route?
Of which proposed route?
Well, you say it's east-west. I mean, do you have?
Yes,
any-
so we have a story map that has all of the existing conditions as well as all the recommendations, and all of the static maps are in the larger plan, as well as a table.
Mr. Warren?
We're trying to develop a town center around the security mall. Is that part of the plan to have, we're trying to do, the bikeable city or the 15-minute city is the plan for the county? Has that been integrated into?
I didn't even know that was a thing. So I have to collaborate on that a little bit more. But there are connections showing in that area as well, all over the county, so.
Are there any other questions at this time? Not seeing any. May I have a motion?
Be it moved that the Baltimore County Planning Board sets an in-person public hearing regarding the bicycle and pedestrian master plan for Thursday, November 16th, 2023 at 5 p.m.
Second.
Thank you. Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Bialik.
Thank you all very
Good
much.
seeing you again.
You too.
Next on our agenda, we have the opportunity to further discuss and then vote on the electric vehicles charging station report. This item was first introduced to the board on September 21st, and a public hearing was conducted on October 5th. Staff from the Department of Planning, the Department of Permits Approval and Inspection, and Sustainability Office are here to answer any questions the board may have as we discuss and before we vote. Would Mr. Lafferty and Ms. Sally Nash like to make any comments at this time?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And we do have Ms. Nash is here. Oh, even esteemed Pete Gutwald is here with us today, as well as Jenny Osa from the Office of Government Affairs and also Sustainability Officer, and Seth Blumen, all of whom were actively, and Brad Kroner from Government Affairs as well, all actively involved in developing this report that came to you. We appreciated the interchange that we had before, the questions that were posed, and we attempted, thanks to Ms. Brophy's written comments, to try to respond and provide some further information, which we hope was helpful in thinking through some of these complicated issues. I will say that what we're trying to anticipate really is the changes that we're going to continue to see in the availability of electric vehicles throughout the county, throughout the state, throughout the country. So it has to be forward thinking, not just as to what the current conditions are, but what we can anticipate. We tried to go point by point with Ms. Brophy's questions. Hopefully we provide some information to further the understanding where we're trying to go with this report. And there were great ideas that we think maybe should be integrated into the report going forward before we send it to the county council. One of the more complicated is the issue of parking and minimum parking. Even in our response, we didn't have a clear recommendation to the board as to what it can be. And there's different ways of looking at percentages, or perhaps one per certain number and as you grow a bigger parking array, that you actually can increase that number. And it is difficult to project how many parking spaces you're really going to need. There were also questions about fire and the threat of fire. Today, and actually based upon a WBL report last night, we sent you another piece of information in which the state's fire marshal has indicated really the incidence of electric vehicle fires is minimal. That's not to say there's not danger. And we do know that lithium-ion batteries are dangerous, and what the fire department will say, and which Assistant Chief Albert Utz told me, was that the really dangers are really like if you have an e-bike or skateboard or something like this that has the lithium iode, and they respond to fires in houses or in garages more than in the open air, like at a parking lot. And there are no reported incidents of actually the charging stations having any fires, and only one incident reported in the state about an EV actually having a fire. The greatest danger is when the battery then is impacted, like through an accident or something of that nature. It's not, and again, not to deny there's some dangers. And in fact, the National Firefighters Association has been looking more carefully at garages. And like as Mr. Heckman raised in the last meeting, there probably needs to be some reconsideration about parking in structured parking garages having EV spaces and where they should be. And there are actually recommendations that they be like in an open air ground floor, so that again, it's less dangerous because you have more airflow. So I guess just trying to say we try to be responsive in the information we provided. Appreciated the fire chief and her people being able to provide us a little bit more information. And there are a couple links in there as well to some national work that's being undertaken. In fact, when I spoke to the chief a couple weeks ago, she had just gotten back from a national conference in which this was one of the primary conversations, because they're very cognizant of the fact that lithium iodes or batteries are going to continue to be prevalent, and as EVs grow in popularity. The only other comment I'll make, and then we can take any questions or however you want to handle it, Madam Chair, is that we do recognize that the data is still not fully developed. I thank Seth Blumen for the research he's done, and we provide you some more information on the number of units and charging stations in the state. But that, again, it's still speculative as to what that might mean for the next 5-10 years as we start to plan. And as we anticipate more development, and how do we accommodate those users who are going to various office buildings or garages or wherever. And the last thing I'll say is that we're willing to work with any recommendations you have and integrate those. This is your report ultimately to the county council. So it's important to reflect the concerns you may have. And while I think the report covered the sort of landscape of concerns that we could surface, certainly anything else you want to add or suggest that go into the report before it actually is transmitted to the council, we're here to serve your needs and answer your questions. So.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Nash, do you want to have any comments you'd like to make? You're good at this time. Board members, do you have any questions or comments? Mr. Warren?
Yeah, and I appreciate it, and thanks for sending over that BAL thing. I watched that last night. That was helpful. The two comments I would have that I heard there and then elsewhere, that our fire department are not prepared today to handle a fire. And, you know, as we fund through the budgeting process, the fire department, some kind of mention to the council that, you know, we put some money in there to make sure they're prepared. That's not fair to them or to our citizens. And the other thing is maybe some zoning, or not zoning, but like permitting issues around garages. I think that's where some of the issues that I've seen nationally, where these cars have caught fire in garages, and the fires are thousands of degrees, and the normal drywall doesn't, what would normally prevent a fire spreading quickly, it doesn't. So those are the two things I would say on it. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. McGinnis?
I think the current optimism on AVs is very overblown. When you look at the statistics, our grid cannot possibly handle the amount of energy would be required to for a fleet of EVs. When you look at the individual basis, the cost of the EV charging level 3 charging stations are a lot more than what they're shown because they're government supported. If you were to fill up, plus the time involved in recharging a battery, if you spend a half an hour at a level 3 charging your battery, compared to a 5-minute stop at a fuel station, and you'll find that the difference in price would be quite different. I think people have been sold a bill of goods that is not sustainable in the long term. The cost of these batteries, where are they coming from? Chinese Communist Party. They control the assets, the places around the world. They control a majority of these places where they're found, even though lithium has recently been discovered in the United States, but it's not to the level of what they are required. The ultimate, in a city where you have level 1, level 2, they can be taken care of existently for the people that have EV cars now at their home or their office, could be handled very easily. When you get to level 3, then you get to a very expensive proposition. The ability of level 3 batteries to charge trucks, buses, long-range vehicles is very suspect at this time. I would never want to start on a trip, cross-country trip, with an EV battery. It's just not practical. It would not be practical on a farm truck or a farm tractor. It would not be practical. The long-term effect is there's going to have to be a combination of sources to charge our fleet or to propel our fleet of cars and vehicles. And that's going to be nuclear, wind and solar, and fossil fuels. It's not going to be one or the other. And I think we're working with a government down edict, which has not been proven by the people. There are acres and acres of cars, EV cars, sitting now that can't be sold or aren't being sold because of the price. And when people make a choice, they're not going to spend that amount of money for these vehicles and what an amount of time they have to spend having them recharged. So I think that we're being very premature on promoting a lot of these EV vehicles. So I guess, and I think people, when it's a government down source, they're not considering a lot of things. And people make their own choices. I think there'll be a different outcome.
Thank you, Mr. McGinnis. Any other board members? Mr. Holka?
I appreciate Mr. McGinnis's comments, but I think all we are trying to do is to give the options for people. No one's going to be forced into it, but to the extent that part of the factor that might make someone decide to go with an EV is if there are charging places available. And this is just to allow the private market and whatnot to make places available. So I don't see it as quite as apocalyptic as you're making it out to be. If no one buys it, well, then they won't build it out as much. But if we don't allow them to be built out, then that becomes its own source of impediment.
Thank you, Mr. Holupka. Ms. Brophy?
First of all, thank you, Director Lafferty and your whole team for answering my many comments. So I appreciate that. So I'm just trying to understand next steps, right? So you said this is kind of a framework that you're laying out to us, and then we can make recommendations for amendments to this framework prior to going to council. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. So I'm not sure if we want to do that by motions after discussion, Madam Chairwoman, however you want to do it. But I did want to bring to the board. So like I said, thank you, Director Lafferty. So you had mentioned there's 5,208 EV registrations right now in the county. I Googled, and hopefully it's right. It's on the Maryland Open Data Portal. There's about 680,000 vehicles registered in Baltimore County overall right now, which is 0.7%. So it's less than 1% right now. I agree with you. We do need to be prepared as EV registrations are increasing. But I would recommend that on that matrix where it had the percentage of proposed parking standards, that we lower that to more meet the current registrations, potentially in a graduated increasing rate. So we could say, by 2025, it will be 10% EV ready, capable. I apologize, the exact terminology. I'm kind of just bringing this out to my fellow board members to think about. And then, say 26, another percentage. But I think based on the increases, I agree, we should be ready for it, like Mr. Halupka said. But I do think that since it's such a small percentage right now in the county, these proposed ratios are very large. So that's my suggestion.
Any other questions or comments from the board?
Did we ever get an answer on this table here? Is this cumulative? So that if we have under multifamily, we did
Yeah,
that
was one of the questions I had.
multifamily, if there's 100 parking spaces, 65% would either have to be installed or ready or capable.
Yeah, so he basically, it was one of the questions I had asked. So number 6 that I had asked, they said on the second page, it said that they realized this is confusing, and they had mentioned some jurisdictions had, 1 EV space per 25. So it was more, I think, there wasn't a direct answer on whether it was cumulative or not, but I think that might be something we propose
Okay.
as
I
being
was,
amended.
yeah, I was, what was the intent? For it to be cumulative or either or?
Is not intended to be cumulative, and therefore, for instance, on multifamily to have 65%. It was a total. I think what we are realizing is that each jurisdiction's approach has been different, and we probably, to be quite candid, just sort of we're overstating what we anticipated as far as future demand. So to lower the ratio or the percentages might be more in line with what some of the other jurisdictions have seen. I think in some of the response to Ms. Brophy's initial questions, there's another chart that showed you some of the international building standards that also then may be more appropriate or at least worth considering.
Mr. Warren?
Again, it's going to be state required that all new vehicles sold in Maryland in 2035 or 2025? What's
2030 or 2035. It's not
Okay.
2025, which is like next year.
So it is being mandated, it's being
2035.
driven to us, so.
And to your point about, and I'll certainly defer to Ms. Nash or Mr. Gutwald on the permitting part, the state is also going to require that all homes, all single-family attached and detached homes that have garage also provide BEV capable. So there's going to be a state standard for new residential development, and many of those will be garages that will be internal to or built into the unit itself, not freestanding. So I don't know how, for instance, our PAI folks will look at the permitting when those start to begin, and when those begin, although most of those would probably be level 1. So that's really like just plugging into your wall, but a separate unit.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Gutwald, you want to stand up and at the podium there, sir? I think you've done
I
this
just gonna
before.
agree with Director Lafferty that the garage is what we're seeing is at most is level 2s, which is similar to your dryer. That's what the level 2 is. So those standards are.
What would you do to double drywall or what other?
Well, then you would start looking at the fire code and what if you thought there needed to be more fire protection at that level, as part of the building code. Yep.
Any other questions or comments? Not hearing any at this time. Mr. Lafferty, should we call for the motion and then add the addendums, or do the addendums first? And
I think it would help if, for instance, I think there's probably uniform agreement, and thank you, Mr. Lipka, for the pictures of the bollards, that something of that nature could be added to ensure safety based on Ms. Wolfson's comments before. If Ms. Brophy has a particular set of percentages that you want to propose that we build in instead of what we have here, it'd probably be good to have that first, and then we could build that into the final report that's adopted.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Brophy?
Okay, so, I mean, I propose that we graduate it, so it's not like a straight, starting January 2024, it's like 15% or whatever the percent is that we all agree on. I propose it's like a yearly basis, it increases. I don't know, sorry if that puts a lot of pressure on PAI and different things, because as people are going for entitlements for different projects every year, the percentage changes. So I want to make sure it's realistic for the county to implement as well, which is why, you know, I would love everybody else's thoughts on that. I don't know if it's like every couple years change, if it's 2035, maybe we work backwards from 2035, whatever the case may be.
I support her comments. Do you have any suggestions or amendment to the motion?
Whether we need to come out with a number, to Mr. McGinnis, and then we'll move forward.
Date?
2035.
That's what-
Maybe 5 years, 5-year increments.
And I would include the language in the amendment that the stations be shielded by bollards.
What do we think about 5 years?
So Madam Chair, in Ms. Brophy's comments, she had suggested, for instance, 10% by 2025, and then she was graduating it annually, but it could be, as she suggested, every 2 or 3 years, goes up another 5%. I don't know what the magical percentage would be by 2035, and how the board wants to look at that. I do also want to suggest that this is a recommendation to the council, so they can modify that.
Exactly right.
But I think to give them some guidance as to what you're thinking would be very valuable. So,
Ms. Brophy, since this was your idea, do you want to try to spin it again?
Sure. I know, I'm gonna try to go backwards, but I'm thinking if we work backwards, well, what is realistic for the county? Like I said, I don't want to do like a yearly change and then it becomes really difficult for the county to implement. If we're talking about 2035, and thank you, Mr. Garwal, I see you nodding, because it is really difficult if it changes every year. We're talking, so 2025, that's 10 years.
12 years from now.
Well, 12, I'm just thinking round numbers. So do we say like every,
You did every 3 years from now.
3
you could have
years?
4.
yeah, we could do that, 4 increments? Yes.
I'll do every 4 years, you keep it
Like, see,
election cycle.
I'm trying to say season.
So in election cycle, keep it every 4 years.
Well, could we base it upon the need or what are we seeing as increased use? So instead of going for years, maybe look at what the use is and then kind of work towards that?
But then it would have to come before us and then before the council every time. Do you see what I mean? That, it's more like, so we're just making recommendations. Like I said, it's less than 1% right now of EV cars compared to total cars in Baltimore County. So it's a very small percentage. But as Director Lafferty stated, I mean, it increases substantially every year based on this 2035 edict. And people are buying more EV cars. I think you said it was like a 40% increase. Is that right, Director Lafferty, in just like the past year or so? So if you're like compounding the 5,000 cars, let's say.
Mr.
Right.
Gutwald, can you come up? Can you come up? So
Trying to make it real for you, my friend.
like every 4 years, is that?
Well, I would suggest you start out with because implementing this is going to be very difficult whether I'm sitting in this chair or not. And somebody remembering that every 4 years they're supposed to modify the parking standards for EV station is going to be a logistical nightmare. So if you started out with a minimum and then you said by 2035 it needs to be at this level, and then let the market dictate themselves. If they want to put more in, they can put more in. But you put a minimum and then you put the standard at the 2035 because that's when it's required by everybody, right? That's my 2 cents worth, because that would make it very easily to be administered. And of course, that's what I'm looking for.
I think every 4 years, this projection could change drastically also.
Anyone else have any comments? Thank you, Mr. Gutwald. Mr. Halupka, I said thank you.
Right, so I mean, one, these are all recommendations, and two, these are all just minimums. If the market requires, particularly for rental places, whatever, that the owners see that there's huge demand, we're not saying they can't put in more. We're just saying, here's the minimum. So, I mean, that suggests, I guess, erring on the low end. And if the market demands more, then presumably people will respond.
So just his comment was, let's say 10% by 25, and what's that percent?
Minimum of 10%, but then it can fluctuate.
Yeah, no, but so you wanted the full number at 25. So is that 35%?
But
or
he's
is that?
not saying like 40%. He's just saying we come up with that full number by 2035.
Yeah, that's all.
So I'm trying
So he gave a good recommendation. Yeah.
So then maybe I propose, then do we just say 5% cumulative? Because we talked about that too, right? Like we don't want it to be each percentage. You could say 5% cumulative by 2025 and then 20% cumulative by 2035. And then it dictates throughout. Like you could add more if you want, or just sit at 5% until all of a sudden 2035 hits and you've got to drop, increase to 20%. I think that would be my idea.
Some of this is making my brain itch. But, multifamily's this, commercial's this, retail's this, and then we're going to graduate it, and is it cumulative or not? Howard County is fairly simple. It's like 1 per 25 spaces, doesn't matter what it is, multifamily, commercial, and we just start out there. And and then we're setting the minimums that way. I think the market will dictate what it's going to need to be, and we don't need to dictate it, really. I think the idea is just to set some minimums and get this thing going. And that's what I would suggest, is making it stupid, simple. And it's not just for me, it's for like developers out there that are trying to anticipate what the requirements are going to be 2 or 3 years down the line.
Mr. Hinton.
No, I do agree. I think setting a minimum and then letting it gradually increase so we don't have to keep coming back here. But I would suggest a higher minimum than 10%, just so that it gives them a little cushion for the developers. I don't know what that number is, maybe 15 or 20. Start there so that you have some protection for any drastic influxes next year. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
May Jenny Osa she was just sort of chirping on my shoulder, but
Absolutely. I saw,
for her to share it with you than to share it.
I saw her moving around quite a bit back there, so I figured she was going to be stepping up sooner or later.
Thank you very
Thank you
much,
for-
Madam Chair and members of the committee. I'm Jen Aosa, and I've been acting as the county's Chief Sustainability Officer. And the point that I was wiggling around about is that if we're talking about EV installed, ready, and capable, sort of in the combination, which I think is appropriate. The big lesson that we have learned over the last couple of years here in Baltimore County installing electric vehicle charging equipment is that you really need to be thinking about the electrical capacity as early as possible. And so if we're talking about having EV ready or EV capable spaces, that simply means if in the future we want to install additional chargers, we can, because we have enough capacity in the building's electrical panel. And so whether that is a home, so the new requirement for homes is not to have an electric vehicle charger installed. It is to make sure that that new construction has capacity to add an additional clothing dryer. And not all older buildings have that. And so from the perspective of the county, we have run into some real challenges adding chargers to some of our older buildings or older lots. And so I think having an incremental or a phased-in approach is absolutely reasonable, but we may not want to be thinking about the minimum. we may want to be thinking about, a certain number per spaces that the building may have. So for 100 spaces, what would be the right number, so that we're making sure we don't have to go back in later and add electrical capacity as we're bumping up the number of chargers we want to have on site.
Thank you for that
Thank you.
clarification. Okay, with that new information, Mr.
But
Halupka?
but then the flip side would be, if we're requiring, particularly for a new builder, we're saying, oh, for every 100 spaces, you need to be ready for 40. I mean, that's additional cost up front that they may or may not need down the road. I mean, so that's what we're trying to balance here. I mean, I take your point. We want to be ready to do it, but do we necessarily want to sort of overcommit right now, which does have a cost to the builders and whoever is buying the units or renting them, et cetera. So
Ms. Brophy?
Okay, so my suggestion is, and I'm gonna repeat it, my suggestion is that we amend it cumulative percentage, so I'm not talking ready, capable, installed, just cumulative minimums, whether it's a percentage or a number of parking spaces. So 5% or 1 out of 20 parking spaces minimum by 2025, and then 20% by 2035, cumulative. That would be my recommendation. And then, just as other people have suggested, the market will dictate whatever's in the middle, but this is just the minimum that would be required. And I'm kind of like Mr. Heckman here. I mean, I was just going to make it simple, like whether it's multifamily, commercial, or retail, it would be the same, because it's still the same out of however many parking spaces. I don't think that the different asset classes would make a difference. That's me personally, unless anybody wants to make a suggestion for different asset classes.
And then after that, and after a few more comments, Ms. Brophy, if you want to make a motion for that we would add, then you do so, and then we'll take a roll call.
Okay.
My only comment is that ready or installed. I think she's saying ready is fine.
Cumulative, just cumulative, whatever you want. You could have 5% installed, you could have 5% ready.
Ready.
It's more just whatever that private.
Want to say
partner-
5% ready? I mean, right now?
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments?
Are we differentiating between the single-family houses or apartments where level 1 and level 2 would be sufficient versus commercial where they may need a level 3?
No, we're just saying any 5%. So you pick as whoever the private or public right of way, whoever wants to pick. You're thinking by demand, this public right of way might need a level 3, 5%, or whatever. And then, for example, if it's multifamily, maybe the private property owner decides they're only going to put in level 2s, that's fine. But if it's a retail, they'll choose level 3s, but the percentage would be the same.
Okay.
And it's the case, right, what we were saying is that by state law, all new single-family homes are going to have be level 2 anyway. So it won't really apply to that one way or the other.
Hey, Ms. Brophy, do you want to say that in a the way you want to put in there, and then someone will second you? However.
Have we had a motion yet?
They're doing that, Wayne.
Okay.
Okay, make it clear.
Okay.
So Taylor,
Amending the motion or
okay,
making one?
we're amending it first. Mr. McGinnis, hold 1 second.
We're not amending anything.
No, but right now she's adding something. She wants to add something. So we want to make sure that's clear. So go ahead.
Okay, so I want to, go ahead.
I don't think there's an motion on the table.
Well,
So she's making the first motion.
Right, that's what we're, no, that's what we're doing. Todd,
So I'm going to make a motion to amend the current proposed parking standards chart that is in the existing plan to state that the proposed parking standards should be 5% cumulative, whether it's EVSE installed, ready, or capable by 2025, and then 20% by 2035. That is my motion.
Second.
oh, okay, all in favor? Okay.
Opposed?
Any opposed? All right, motion carries. Any other questions or comments? If none,
I do want the two motions that I talked about in there. One, that we prepare the fire department, or that there's a plan to prepare the fire department to put out these fires. I don't know where that's in the.
okay. Mr. Yes, Okay, Mr. Warren, do you want to make a motion for amendment?
I don't know where in this I would be making the amendment, but I would like it added to the
That's what I'm saying.
document that the fire department get adequate training and i.e. equipment to be able to put out these fires that would be started in an EV vehicle.
All right, do we have a,
I'm worried about the vehicles that are gonna be-
is that your motion?
that's my motion.
Do we have a second to his motion?
Second.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
And that any public stations, whether on private or public property, be shielded by bollards.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
And the last one I had was about having the garages fire coded to take on the new heat that a fire like this would cause in a garage.
That's a building code thing.
I don't want to be in a house that catches on fire that burns down in 20 seconds because
Yeah,
of the-
although I guess I'd want to see sort of the cost benefit. If it's a very rare thing that the thing catches on fire, how much would we be adding to any new development cost and how does that sort of play out? So that would be my reluctance.
You know, I'm delicate to that, but I mean,
Yeah.
what I've seen on TV and what I've read on this, when these things go off, these houses burn down. I mean, they explode. So
Madam Chair, we could add something in there that as part of the review of the fire code to examine this aspect, because clearly it's, particularly now with the state law, there are going to, I'm sure, be many more reviews of the current code and whether it's sufficient and tested. And I'm sure that's going to be true for parking structures as well. So
I support that motion
we
that
can-
you say.
we can just add a comment that be considered.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess I'll make a motion that as part of this package, that the fire code is reviewed due to the additional heat and equipment and that's needed basically to put out these types of fires, right? So that's the motion, is basically just to review that along with this package. Is that good?
I think we already have a motion for the fire department, but this is just for the garage.
Yeah.
And I
Anybody,
second that.
all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, is there anything else that anyone likes to add? I'm not looking at Todd anymore. Okay, if not, can I entertain a motion?
Be it moved that the planning board accept the electric vehicle charging stations report as amended, dated September 7th, 2023, and forwards it on to the county council for further review and consideration.
Thank you.
Second.
Right, I have to take a roll call. Mr. Array?
Aye.
Ms. Brophy?
Aye.
Ms. German? Mr. Hafer's not here. Mr. Heckman?
Aye.
Mr. Heinel?
Aye.
Mr. Hinton? Mr. Halipka?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. McGinnis?
A weak eye.
Mr. Perlo's not with us. Ms. Panero's not with us. Mr. Warren?
Aye.
Ms. Wolfson?
Aye.
Thank you all. Motion carries. All right, Ms. Bensley, you will now fill us in on legislation recently passed by the county council since our last meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Bill 6923, Building Improvement Loan Fund, for the purpose of transferring administration of the Building Improvement Loan Fund from the Department of Planning to the Department of Economic and Workforce Development, and generally relating to the Building Improvement Loan Fund. Bill 7423, Zoning Regulations, Uses Permitted Manufacturing Light ML Zone and Manufacturing Heavy MH Zone, for the purpose of permitting certain uses on certain tracts of land in the ML zone and the MH zone, and generally relating to the ML and MH zones. Resolution 3223, Baltimore County Council Structure Review Work Group, a resolution of the Baltimore County Council establishing the Baltimore County Council Structure Review Work Group. Baltimore County has more than 850,000 residents, the third largest population in Maryland, and has grown increasingly diverse, with people of color composing 47% of the county's population in the 2020 census report. The Baltimore County Council is comprised of seven members, and community activists are advocating the need for more diverse representation and a lower ratio of constituents per council member. The council seeks to examine this issue and develop a consensus recommendation on changes that are appropriate. The Baltimore County Council Structure Review Work Group is established to conduct research and make recommendations by March 31st, 2024. The work group shall consist of one appointee from the county executive, one appointee from each member of the county council, one representative appointed by the county council from the Baltimore County Planning Board, one representative appointed by the county council from an area college or university with expertise in political science or government, one representative appointed by the county council with expertise in demographics, and 2 ex officio members. And that concludes the report.
Thank you, Ms. Bensley. Well, that concludes our agenda. We will reconvene for a public hearing at 5 o'clock. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
See you all in 10. Right. Good evening again, and welcome to the Baltimore County Planning Board public hearing on the short-term rental report in response to County Council Resolution 13-23. The public hearing is now called to order. I'm Nancy Hafford, the chair of the Baltimore County Planning Board, and we will now start with a roll call to account for all of our members that are in the room, not in the back. When you hear your name, please say aye. Mr. Array.
Aye.
Ms. Brophy.
Aye.
Ms. German. Aye. Mr. Hafer's not here. Mr. Heckman.
Aye.
Mr. Heinl.
Aye.
Mr. Hinton.
Aye.
Mr. Halipka.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. McGinnis.
Aye.
Mr. Perlow is not with us. Ms. Spinero is not with us. Mr. Warren.
Aye.
Ms. Wolfson.
Aye.
Thank you. This evening, we have a public hearing on short-term rental report in response to the resolution 13-23. This item was first introduced to the board on October 19th, 2023, with a presentation by Mr. Lafferty from the Department of Planning and Ms. Sally Nash from the Department of Permits Approval and Inspection. Tonight, Mr. Lafferty and Ms. Nash are here to further present on their report to the board members. Following their presentation, board members will have a chance to ask questions, and then members of the public will have an opportunity to speak on this matter. Please join me again in welcoming Mr. Lafferty and Ms. Nash.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Planning Board. I'll begin the presentation, then turn it over to Sally to go through the recommendations, excuse me, that we have developed. Once again, this was a multi-agency initiative with Permits Approval Inspection, Planning Department, and the Office of Government Affairs. The County Council has requested that the Planning Board conduct a review of the trends, the growing trend and proliferation of short-term rental properties in the county, and consider making recommendations for possible legislation to integrate the rental housing option into county laws, regulations, and policies for their use. So these are some of the short-term rental platforms that we may know, or there are many, many others out there. VRBO and Airbnb are probably the most common. And these are what we're seeing now, not only here in Baltimore County and in Maryland, but throughout the country. Next slide. And here are some of those that we were able to pick up from the internet. Some of the properties that are being listed now in Baltimore County. And as you can see, they're all, various places. I think Mr. McGinnis during the introduction asked about where are most of them located. and we have some data that shows mostly on the east side. But you can see here, Moncton, Lutherville, Catonsville, Owings Mills, Perry Hall as well. So they are located throughout the jurisdiction. There are a number of reasons that the council has requested this be examined. And we also recognize there are a lot of issues and concerns that other people may have. One is that, a property owner can benefit financially from renting a property. There's some economic well-being or good that can be derived. At the same time, if there are too many, potentially, what is the impact on the character of the neighborhood and home ownership community that could turn into predominantly rental or largely rental is, I think, a concern. Thirdly is we do have rental registration laws in the county. How many of them are complying with this, with the laws in order to make sure that they're regulated as we would wish. And then there's a concern, of course, that many of these become party venues on a short-term basis, long weekends, for instance, that can result in traffic trash, other noise issues that may or may not be code violations. Ms. Wolfson asked in earlier meeting about, I guess there must be something similar for camps. We understand there's something similar for swimming pools. So people who really rent out their backyard swimming pool for parties. And so there are many platforms for people to utilize. And we want, while we're not going to dive into all of those, no pun intended, that we're certainly concerned about what's happening with the rentals. Current practices in the county really are under the purview of permits, approval, and inspections, because they handle all complaints about rental properties in the county. They regulate rental licenses. And so short-term and long-term rentals are addressed basically in the same way under the current operation by PAI. One can get a rental license for 3 years, and whether it's owner-occupied or not isn't treated any differently. But also the county recognizes that we do not have complete information or robust knowledge of the location and numbers of all the different rentals that may be in the property, in the county. The county does have something, though, that started off as a pilot at UMBC and at Towson, which is called the Social Host Unruly Social Gatherings Ordinance. And this enables the police actually to issue citations to the responsible party to actually break up an unruly social gathering. And compliments really to Councilman Marks, who initiated that primarily because of Towson University and a lot of the problems that the neighbors were having. So there is already on the books a mechanism by which unruly behavior can be addressed by contacting the police. And it applies to the property owner or whoever the responsible person would be in the household. And then as part of our process, we did look at what's going on in other parts of the country, but we also honed in on some of the jurisdictions in the state as well. And we learned that Montgomery, Prince George's, Anne Arundel, and the city have all passed legislation that established short-term rental registration programs. And when we looked at the 4 jurisdictions, there were some common themes that emerged, including creating a short-term rental registration system, setting a time limit for the number of days a STR can be rented, requiring that the owner or owner's agent be within proximity to respond if there are any issues or problems, setting a limit on the number of guests that can be in the short-term rental, and also parking minimums so that, of course, you have the ability to take care of all the vehicles that may be there for a rental. And although many other jurisdictions across the country have started to actually regulate the platform itself, we are not suggesting or recommending that approach, that we'll focus primarily on the rental unit itself. And also in getting to this point with recommendations, we consulted with the Office of Law and proposed a number of issues, questions to them. So the county can establish limits on the number of short-term rentals. We're able to treat differently an owner-occupied or an investor-owned property, but we don't need to, but we can. We can limit the number of days that a single-family dwelling can be rented as a short-term rental. We can limit the number of short-term rentals that are licensed throughout the county as well. And we also want to know, well, how are these distinguishable from bed and breakfasts, rooming and boarding houses, hotels, ADUs that are all provided for in the code. And you'll see on pages 5 and 6 in the report, full report, different distinctive definitions that are show how they are different in this from what short-term rental may be here. We also asked about the enforcement authority, and the county cannot revoke a short-term rental permit only because of complaints. If we set it up based on number of violations, that's different, but not based on complaints alone. And then, of course, the question is, can you evict or remove renters, and often referred to as weekend warriors, and we would not be able to do that. So that's really the background for now, the recommendations that we've developed. So I'll ask Sally to please come up and walk through the recommendations for you. And then we're free to answer any questions. Thanks.
All right. Good afternoon. Sally Nash, Permits, Approvals, and Inspections. I'm going to walk through the recommendations of the report, starting with number 1. And I should say some of these recommendations are already ongoing. Some of them require council action. But this first one is an example of one that is underway. It has been funded by the CE, and we've even executed the PO. If you know anything about purchasing in the county, that's a small miracle. So we hope, next slide, hope to have that implemented soon. And what this software does is called Granicus, or host compliance. What it does is pretty impressive. It can identify any property that's advertising itself on any of these platforms. They check these platforms daily, see who's registered, and then they can cross-reference those addresses with what we have in our system as far as properties that have registered. Next slide. So from this host compliance, we can log into this platform, and from that we can see a lot of different details about the listing itself. Next slide. For example, we can see the number of guests that a place has typically had, the length of stays, all kinds of property information. Next slide. But most importantly is what I mentioned, is this being able to identify properties that we have no idea if they're being used as a short-term rental or a rental at all, and making sure that they come into compliance. And they can even help us send out letters to these properties that are being listed. So host compliance did a little bit of research in Baltimore County. They found there's 662 listings in Baltimore County, which represents about 554 unique rental units. So some of these properties are cross-listing, you know, on VRBO and Airbnb, so they get counted twice. We have registered, so when we take in, as Steve mentioned, we don't differentiate between short-term rentals and long-term rentals when we're registering our rental properties. The same rules apply no matter what you're doing. We have, within the last 2 years, added a little checkbox. If you are a short-term rental, you know, please check this box. So of those, we have 267 people who have checked that box. So, I mean, there's no penalty for not checking that box if you actually are a short-term rental, you know, or if you miss the box, you know, it's just sort of for our information. So, I mean, 267 isn't a terrible number compared to 554, but obviously we have some work to do to bring more people into the system. Next slide. Again, just some more of the functionality of this site. Shows unit types, single family homes versus multifamilies, et cetera. And then also, if it's people are renting out their whole homes or just part of their homes, because that becomes important once we start talking about regulations and whether these are hosted or unhosted short-term rentals. So the idea for a hosted short-term rental is you live in the house, you need a roommate. You don't necessarily want a long-term roommate, but you're going to rent out a room in your house for a week or two, you know, help you make a little bit of money to pay the rent. You're there the whole time. You know, that's hosted. So you're seeing, you know, you're making sure the trash goes out. You're making sure that you're not annoying the neighbors. The unhosted is when either you leave your house or it's an investor property and they're never there. And then whoever comes in can use the house. Next slide. They also looked at year-over-year growth for short-term rentals in the county, about 33% compared to last year. And next slide. So as I mentioned, fully implemented might be a little too optimistic, but it will be well on its way to full implementation by January 2024. I'd like to collect a whole year's worth of data before we make too many policy or legislative decisions, because there is a seasonality to this business. You know, obviously on the east side of the county, people are coming to those houses during the summer to spend the weekend on the water. You know, that's very different than a house that might be used in Towson or, you know, near a university where it might be parents who come in for game weekends or something like that. So we kind of need a certain period of time to really be able to understand how these are being used and who they're being used by. Next slide. And our second recommendation would be for council to create legislation that looks to our neighboring jurisdictions to see what they've done, those best practices that Steve mentioned, using the benchmark data. What are some common themes in all of the legislation that we see in other jurisdictions? So a lot of places have things about the terms and how the licenses are renewed. So we can look at, do we want a separate registration system for short-term rentals that we could then apply different standards for those kinds of uses than just a regular run-of-the-mill long-term rentals? We might have additional requirements. We could have limits on the length of day, the limit of days you can stay, or the number of guests you can have. Also, for our long-term rentals, there aren't any additional parking requirements. That's something, you know, the big impacts of these short-term rentals are often parking and trash. So that's something that the council might want to consider in legislation. Like, well, you have to be able to show that you have 2 off-street parking spaces if you're going to use your house as a short-term rental, you know, for example. Also, a key thing, and this is in I think almost every piece of legislation we've seen in other jurisdictions, is that if the homeowner isn't there, there has to be a managing agent who can be reached within a short period of time. You know, if it's 30 minutes or whatever it is, they need to be able to be on site to deal with a rowdy party or whatever the issue is. So that's a common theme in many different pieces of legislation we've seen. Also, making sure the trash, if there's a trash plan requirement, making sure that's enforced and that the trash is going out on the day of the week that the trash is supposed to come, you know, when there might not be anyone staying at the house. Next slide. So in the report, we took a stab at some sample legislation. If you know, this is again like the EV charging report. If that's something you like, you want to put that forward to the council. If you want to make changes, we can change the report. You know, this is your report to council. So similar to EV charging. We just use our benchmarking information to make some suggestions. Next slide. And one of those suggestions is making a separate registration process for short-term rentals. And that's to help us keep track of them. And if there are going to be different regulations. I mean, we could just keep doing what we're doing now. You know, once we have host compliance, we'll be able to make sure people at least have a rental license. So there won't be any additional requirements that these people have to follow, but we will at least know that they have a safe property that's been inspected, they have smoke detectors, and you know, that they meet the general requirements for a rental property. Our licensing cost is $60 for our regular rentals. And that is low. I know the host compliance people thought that was shockingly low, but some jurisdictions that have higher costs, they include a inspection from one of their inspectors in that cost. Whereas we require that the owners of the property hire a licensed inspector who then gives us a report with their application. So that is a cost. So we don't charge for that because they have to pay for that separately between them and the licensed inspector. Next slide. So in addition to what I mentioned before, if we had a separate registration process for these properties, the new application would ask for additional information such as, is this a hosted property or is it unhosted? What kind of dwelling is it? It would clarify that there's a limit on the number of guests you can have and any other additional restrictions. Next slide. We could also include getting information about whether the property is served by a septic system, which could be an issue if they are having larger events, and can help us to make sure that the properties are paying their transitory occupancy tax, which is a big source of revenue for the county that we get from hotels and properties like the short-term rentals. And they're supposed to be paying it now, but this will help monitor that. Next slide. Other conditions we could consider for legislation are the responsibilities of the managing agent. We could also consider limiting unhosted activity and preventing private parties as a condition of them getting their license. Next slide. And lastly, any proposed legislation could reinforce existing policies which are currently in place. We can suspend licenses based on a number of violations if they have a rental property. But that's something we could tweak, make stricter, or just keep how it is if we so desire. So that concludes our recommendations for short-term rentals. Are there any questions for me or Mr. Lafferty?
Just a quick question. What's the definition of a short-term rental? Is there like a days or?
Less than 30 days.
Less than 30. Thank you.
I have
Mr. Heinl?
a comment. With regard to limiting the number of days, I'm aware, not that I own them, but very aware of other people who purchase properties for the purpose of short-term rentals because they like to use it a couple days here and there, but many times they use something called a 1031 to purchase that property, and they can only use that property a minimum number of days restricted by the tax code. So there's a reverse issue here of you're saying they can only rent it a certain number of days or very much limited. I would be highly concerned, and maybe this is addressing the issue because there's other things that are being talked about here, but I think that limiting them to only a certain number of days would highly defeat what they thought they could do when they purchased the property in the first place. And obviously the tax code doesn't require they rent it. They have to make it available and they're limited on how much they can use it. But to say they might only be able to rent it for 120 days out of 365 would dramatically impact the purpose and defeat what they try to do in the first place.
We proposed 180 because that's what we saw in other jurisdictions for unhosted rental. And again, that's something you could recommend either is eliminated or increased or decreased. We went back and forth on that a little bit. We even did math, like the number of weekends each year, and what is the likely use. Again, that's something too that might be helpful when we have more data from host compliance to see how often are people renting these out. Is anyone really using it for more than 180 days? I don't know. So,
Mr. Warren?
I have to agree with that, your comment that you know, as a financer of properties, if this could be okay if it was from this point forward, but anybody that brought properties with the intent to do this.
They could be
I know in
grandfathered.
Florida, it's an issue that they now say 6 months minimum rental in a lot of places, but it's only for new purchasers. They can't go back and retro that. So I agree with that.
Mr. Johnson.
Couple questions here. I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not trying to say or anything, but I just have a problem with things being regulated to the point where if I have a party, somebody can call the police. And because we're barbecuing, we may be a little loud, I get a citation. I have an issue with, I guess, that part of it. And I guess I need to know, I mean, are there instances where the police are called a lot for these that citations would have to be given out? And I mean, currently now?
I mean, not a lot. There are a handful of properties that have repeat offenses like that. And I don't think we have any records of someone where code enforcement has gone out and issued more than one violation. I don't even think the police department has had to go out, you know, multiple times to any particular properties. But I do know that we get complaints that people are using these houses as party houses. You know, this is no longer a quiet single-family residential neighborhood. It has become like a party house where they have parties every weekend with different people. We hear that complaint anecdotally a lot. I wouldn't say that we have a lot of specific evidence or, you know, situations where we've taken one of those property owners to the administrative law judge.
Mr. Johnson, if I may add to that, we did reach out to the police department because we do have the social gathering legislation on the books now. And I'm not sure that your loud backyard barbecue party would get unruly, and maybe you're more of a party animal than I think. But I think it was really intended when, you know, frankly, college students would have 15, 20, 30 people and have, you know, go way into the middle of the night and therefore be very disruptive to the community. But we did reach out to the police. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get data, didn't really get a response from them to get some data on the social host ordinance and how that's, if they have repeat offenders. That's already on the books. That's not related to this. And actually, one of our recommendations is to encourage people to not only abide by the social host ordinance, but if that is the issue, it may not be a short-term rental issue. It may be, in fact, because people are you know, just acting unruly.
Any other questions?
I think I heard you say that by registering everybody, we could go out and check and make sure that it's safe and that it has smoke detectors and all of that. I'm wondering if we're opening ourselves up to liability by representing we've made sure it's safe, and if something happens, the county can get sued.
So for our rental licenses now, we require an inspection by a state licensed inspector, and they're the ones who have to say, yep, the smoke detector's operable, there's hot water, you know, there aren't any wires that are exposed. You know, they have a list that they have to check off, and then they submit that report with the application. And so that's what I'm saying we would require for these short-term rentals, because the 267 people, they did that. The other people haven't done that. So I don't know if those houses have working smoke detectors. It is actually the tenant's responsibility, though. Once the property is rented, it is the tenant's responsibility to ensure that the smoke detectors are working and things like that. So, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the liability, but it would be no different than what we take on now for our regular rentals.
Mr. Halipka.
Although, I mean, I can understand that if you're renting a house or whatever, you're responsible for the regular upkeep. But if you're renting something for a weekend or for a couple of days, I don't think I would necessarily expect that I'm going to go in and check to see if the smoke detector is working.
Right. And that's, you know, maybe something we could consider if we do have a separate registration process for short-term rentals, that, you know, maybe the managing agent has to check it each time or something like that. But currently, as the state law is written, it is the tenant's responsibility.
Any other questions?
We have several houses on the farms that are being rented now, and my grandson thought that that would be a great profit motive to do short-term rentals. But when I considered the use of that property during a snowstorm, a hurricane, or other times when no one is there, and the damage on the little party scene at the time, so far, we've decided not to go that route. But we also have rented a house to a young couple for a yearly rental. And we found after about a month, there didn't seem to be anybody there during the week. And then there seemed to be people around there during the weekend. So they were using it as a party house. So we just had them evicted, and that took care of that problem. But I can see there's problems both ways on this.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McGinnis. Any other questions?
We do have a recommendation as well that if you have a long-term rental license, you cannot then also get a short-term rental license, especially if you're not the owner, especially if you're not the property owner. But in any case.
Mr. Hinton.
My question, I know you said you might not have the data, but has this unruly social gathering ordinance or whatever had any success or?
I don't know, Brad, do you want to say anything? Or
It started off as a pilot in Towson, and I would say that the residents in the communities, particularly to the east of York Road, I think was highly successful and was able to quell a lot of the really large gatherings that were causing problems in the neighborhood. It's now applied countywide. So they took the pilot program and then now apply it across the entire county.
I guess my other question would be kind of going along with some of the board members saying about overregulation. I mean, I get the feeling that it's a few niche communities worried about how things are beginning to change. And maybe, the fact that you live in a college town, that's just what happens. You go to Frostburg, this is going to happen. You live in Towson, the kids are going to be here. But the ability, but to broaden it to everyone else where it seems like it's not so many complaints, that would be my only concern.
I think that's why we're proposing that we gather a year's worth of data to really see, because some of the concerns that were raised by the council had to do with, we know that this one house is a problem. Well, we don't know if it's a short-term rental or if it's, what other issues are going on. I think as Sally said, that the Granicus software tool will be very helpful in starting to identify some of those issues and the extent of the issues if there are problems. At the same time, if people are renting the property, they should be registered with the county. So that's another mechanism to make sure they're safe, because you want people to be in safe places.
I have a family member that has a house in Redondo Beach, California, gorgeous house. And she, for the last probably 15 years, belongs to this group where they exchange homes all over the world. She travels all over the world. Are those homes considered part of this, since there's no financial transaction? They're just swapping homes?
no, it would be exempt. It's only if you are advertising on an online platform.
All right.
But I would like to join.
I know. I mean, she's gone to great places. And she usually gets a use of a car, too. Well, okay, that being said, still no one signed up to speak? All right. At this time, we have no one signed up to speak, and if there are no other further questions from the board, this is the conclusion of our public hearing. And as a reminder, this item is tentatively scheduled for a vote at the next board meeting on November 16th. Thank you all, and do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Amen.